Hello, and welcome to the Digital Workspace Works podcast. I'm Ryan Purvis, your host, supported by our producer Heather Bicknell. In this series, you'll hear stories and opinions from experts in the field, stories from the front lines, the problems they face and how they solved them, the areas they focused on from technology, people and processes, to the approaches they took that will help you to get to the grips with the digital workspace inner workings.
So Jeremy, welcome on the Digital Workspace Works podcast. You want to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. My name is Jeremy Snyder. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a little company called FireTail.io.
Great. And we are restarting a little bit because I didn't press the record button properly. What does a digital workspace mean to you?
Yeah, I think a digital workspace to me is what enables a company like ours to actually function. We are 11 people spread across 4 countries, about 7 or 8 cities. And, it allows us to collaborate together in a virtual manner, right? And that's not just, let's say, email or Slack messages or things like that, but it allows us to collectively build a software product and to do all the necessary collaboration that goes into that: planning, design specifications, execution, etc. I think a lot of times when people hear digital workspace, their minds go towards virtual desktops or just like Office 365 or Google Workspace, which is possibly a component, but I think it's much, much more. It's got to be the holistic view of the tools and the collaboration methods that allow you to work together like we do.
Yeah. And I mean, I was saying with Heather about this before, the AI components now are becoming part of that digital workspace. And whether you're working remote or hybrid, you mentioned the virtual desktop or even the physical, laptop or tower, how you work in each of those places has different experiences and different connections, which is interesting because what you guys do at FireTail, now that I've had a deeper look at your website, APIs are very important
For sure.
what we do. So how did FireTail start for you?
Yeah, it's the culmination of the last kind of 7, 8, 10 years of my career. So from 2016 to 2020, I was working for a software company that provided a solution in a category that came to be known as cloud security posture management. It was really just helping companies that had, let's say, large scale AWS, Azure, Google footprints to maintain a real-time inventory of all of the infrastructure resources that they were creating, and then check the configuration for security flaws. And, we ran that business for a number of years. I was one of the early employees, although not one of the co-founders, but my role there was to work with some of our most complex and most challenging customers. So I was actually spending a lot of time on planes, going around the world, talking to some very large, sophisticated digital native organizations. And in about 2019, I started to observe a real shift in architectures. What I mean by that is, like, let's call it the first phase of cloud computing was really, oh, okay, let me get out of my data center because managing hardware is a pain in the butt. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an inventory of my physical servers, and I'm just going to recreate that on the cloud by taking kind of comparable virtual machines. But then you kind of realize over time that that doesn't get you the agility that you've been promised by these cloud computing platforms. They're like, oh, scale up, scale down, scale out, scale in, basically like make your infrastructure size match the demand size. And that is absolutely achievable, but it's very difficult with virtual machines. The things that actually let you get there is when you start to go to a much more agile infrastructure and software architecture. And so we started to see that shift at large scale in about 2019. And you'll hear, microservice architecture, you'll hear service-oriented architecture, any number of kind of labels or descriptions of how that actually plays out. But one of the things that we realized was that whichever path you go, whether you call it microservices or not, whether you go serverless or containers or some combination thereof, you pretty much always end up with a bunch of APIs. And you end up with services talking to each other over APIs. And almost every element of data is transferred from system A to system B over an API. Every business function invoked is via an API. So I had this little bit of a light bulb moment back in 2019 about like, hey, there's going to be a lot more APIs in the future. And kind of filed that away as we continued to grow that business. That company got acquired in 2020. I spent some time working for the company that acquired us. And then in late 2021, when I left them, I kind of came back to this idea and started to explore it deeper. And really, that's the beginning story of FireTail.
I mean, are you plugging onto someone's APIs to secure them, or are you an SDK or something that's pulled into the APIs Like, how do you actually work with the APIs?
The answer is yes. So we have both models. So we do have a set of open source code libraries that are kind of the second part of what you said. They're more the SDK side. So
Yeah.
let's say
Okay.
you're building an API in one of the languages we support, which at this point are, might be forgetting one, but it's Ruby, Node.js, Golang, and Python. And we've got Rust and Java coming soon. But if you're building an API using one of those code languages and one of the supported API frameworks, you can very quickly just drop this SDK in. And what it does is it
Yeah.
actually inspects API calls in real time and has blocking capabilities. So if you say like, what is a bad API call? What is a good API call as defined by your API specification? We can filter out all the malicious traffic and kind of treat that accordingly. If you are using, either another language or you don't want to go through the SDK integration, we've got plugins for all the cloud provider platforms, their API gateways, load balancers, et cetera. And you can kind of leverage our functionality there. We additionally have things for Nginx, API 6, and some of the other common tools, TrackND, et cetera.
So, I mean, conceivably, I could have an Azure or an AWS or a Google Cloud subscription and switch this on with my WAF.
Yeah, we can actually automate
well.
WAF rules for you as well. So we can detect signals out of API logs and use that to inform WAF rules, automatically block particular bad actors.
Wow. That's pretty cool. So I mean, you mentioned 11 people and you mentioned 4 countries. Which countries are you in? I mean, I'm just curious about how you how you chose your people and all that kind of stuff.
So USA, Ireland, Finland, and Greece. And
oh, wow.
Okay. Yeah. And my co-founder, who we were chatting before we started recording, is a New Zealander married to an Estonian living in Dublin. And so, it was kind of natural to start building the technical team around him. He leads our software engineering efforts, obviously, as the CTO.
Yeah.
And so our development team is there and in Finland. Our VP of product is somebody who came with a deep technical background and at a previous company had to build a homegrown API security toolkit. So had a lot of familiarity and affinity for this problem space. And, across the two of them, we kind of built the technical teams around them. Greece is a little bit of an outlier. There's a security researcher that we met and found in Greece who specializes in APIs. And it was just a natural fit. And we were like, yeah, sure, we'll make it work. So that was just a question of finding the right person. And, geography didn't really hold us back in that case.
And it shouldn't matter. I mean, time zone wise, it's a couple hours here or there. And I think, with what you're doing, you have to, and we currently have a client of ours being hit by tax. They didn't accept some accounts, some Russians wanting to open some accounts. And because of that, they launched an attack. And when we were going through the logs, it actually realized that the attacks weren't coming from Russia, they're coming from Mexico.
Yep.
So you've got to have a globalized footprint by default nowadays. I think anytime you're localizing yourself to one geography, you're actually weakening your business.
For sure. And the other thing, though, in what you said, it actually calls back to something that you said earlier. One of the challenges that we see around WAFs in particular is how would you define a set of WAF rules to block that actor? Right? There are Russians coming from Mexico. Do you block Russia? Do you block Mexico? Do you block both? What's the risk of blocking legitimate users from Mexico? Right. And then, by the way, there are any number of VPN services and cloud platforms that pretty much anybody with a credit card can get access to. And I can launch requests from, 32 countries within the world with just an AWS account and a credit card. How are you going to block that? So there are good things about WAFs, but there are limitations on the WAF side in terms of actually defending APIs in particular, which is obviously where our narrow focus is. So that's where my mind tends to go. But it is a legitimate problem that a lot of organizations have, whether it's API or not. Understanding where traffic and where user requests come from is a real challenge.
Yeah, and that's the thing and it's funny you make that comment about just a credit card and an AWS account, because when we were discussing the issue yesterday, I was just thinking these guys have probably done exactly that. They've probably set themselves up with any of the providers. They don't need to have like a whole bunch of desktops sitting in their shed. No. They just go sign up and they deploy their scripts and they keep running the scripts until someone picks it up and then they move to the next one and they move to the next one. Yeah. They probably have hundreds of fake profiles that they've created over the years. If you really want to be undetectable, you could set up your bot network over time and then just switch it on when you need it, and it'll remove. These are very clever people, often.
Yeah. These
So I can understand your real-time monitoring and how you adjust to it.
Yeah, these bot networks are actually getting more and more intelligent, by the way. And it kind of calls back to something else that you said earlier in the conversation from the AI perspective. So one of the things that we see in our own labs when we're just testing stuff, we stand up APIs all the time for testing purposes, right? Do we defend well against this or that? Do we protect this type of API, that type of API, et cetera, right? As we stand things up, we'll stand them up in random AWS regions around the world, no DNS names, random IP addresses.
Okay. Yeah.
All of these things get traffic within 3 to 5 minutes, right? So just some random thing coming online somewhere in the world will get traffic in 3 to 5 minutes. And then, by the way, it gets follow-up traffic. And it gets follow-up traffic that is a little bit more intelligent and is getting more and more intelligent as well. So it's not just, okay, there is something that lives there. It's, let me go figure out what that thing is. Oh, it has a fingerprint hint of being WordPress, as an example. Well, let's send some WordPress targeted traffic that leverages some known exploits against WordPress and see if we get a response. Let's request the WordPress login page, the admin accounts. Oh, maybe it's running this vulnerable WordPress plugin. Let me send a a request targeted at a certain piece of PHP code that we know would be in that plugin, et cetera. This is something where AI is actually making that process better from the standpoint of the attackers and a little bit worse from the standpoint of the defenders. So if you're standing up anything that has vulnerabilities in it and you don't have some mitigations in place, I would say the confidence that those vulnerabilities would be found is pretty high at this point.
It's a very sobering thought, because you used to have time when a vulnerability was found and a patch was provided to, one, the vulnerability being found, but you'd have some time till they patched it, because you would think not many people know about the vulnerability. That's why 0 days is obviously such a risky thing. But now the penetration and the follow through can be automated to such an extent, and intelligently automated. It is a very scary thought, actually, because there's a lot of environments that are not patched, that are not maintained.
Yeah.
And, if you one getting the data that's in those environments is a risk, but also going back to our point around these guys can set up in any environment. If they take over your environment, you become like an accomplice to what they're doing, which is also a scary thought.
Yeah, and we see a particular attack vector in APIs around something called SSRF, server-side request forwarding, or forgery, sorry. And what this is that if you've got a vulnerability at the edge of your application stack around the API, to your point about becoming an accomplice, your API may be vulnerable to an attacker sending a request to your API that has an embedded payload that tells your API to forward this request onward. And so your API or your service becomes a bit of man in the middle, but from the standpoint of the actual target destination, you look like the origin. And so the backlash could come to your organization, right? So there are a number of vulnerabilities and kind of new techniques coming out all the time, which is, again, a little bit sobering. It's why the concept of zero trust is so powerful. Zero trust in an API aspect, and we're maybe getting a little bit far down the rabbit hole on the API side, you let me know, but really your API should function in a way such that it only allows requests of the type that should be allowed. And so that should really be down to, if my API expects the authentication of type X to be passed in the header, and then you should only be requesting these 3 parameters, and each parameter should have a limited specification on, okay, number 1 is an alphanumeric string of length 10, and number 2 is an integer between 0 and 50, and number 3 can be, maybe more free text because we're saving like a comment on a blog post or on a photo or something like that. But we absolutely have to do input sanitization and make sure that special characters are handled properly. We look out for malicious strings in there, SQL injection, anything like that. And so you kind of need to build your API from the bottom up in a way such that it only serves legitimate requests that match the request format that is specified. That's a challenging thing because by default, that has not been the case historically.
Yeah, I mean, I just look at sometimes, and I don't want to be sort of shaming you developers, but sometimes someone who builds an API doesn't build it to any set level of security spec, let alone the basics.
Yeah.
And because the person testing it doesn't know any better, the person that's signing it off assumes everyone knows their job. That API gets out there and it just takes one.
Yep.
And, you know, that's what everyone's looking for. So security by design or security as part of the design process isn't often even a consideration, much like testing often isn't part of any consideration because there's always this pressure to deliver. And, you know, no one wants to hear that you're going to go through another testing cycle because they found something. But I think the reality is that every business should be doing a pen test multiple times a year. Something like what you've got makes a lot of sense now.
Yeah.
Just based on what we've discussed, you know, it's kind of writing the horror stories of every CISO, every CEO that has an exposed API, because in the end, every business now is a technology business. Even the guy who was cleaning my couch earlier was telling me how much he relies on his phone and to take payments and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Take bookings, take payments, probably send this info to his bookkeeper or file his taxes, every aspect of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously he's relying on other people's platforms to deliver for him.
Yeah.
But if one of those guys goes down, that's his business. Go back to pen and paper. Which he could probably survive. But you know, as more reliant we get on these things, the higher the risk of it being, you know, fundamentally a calamity.
Yeah, for sure. By the way, to your point about relying on other people's platforms, all of those platforms talk to each other over APIs. They are you know, the connective tissue of the modern internet. I mean, I think it's just like staggering to understand. Even I, you know, seeing that trend that I saw back in 2019 that gave the initial idea to the company, my co-founder and I, we didn't understand the scale of API utilization on the web as it is today and the growth rates that it's accelerating at. We didn't even appreciate it when we started the business, like just how fast it is.
Well, it's funny because so the other business that I'm involved in, Phoenix One, we take the API and we make it beautiful. That's the tagline. So we put you take the API, we put pages, widgets, build the app, all that on top. And the reason why we see resonance in the market is because everyone's happy to build an API. No one wants to get involved in the UI piece. Because it's hard. You know, that's the hardest part. It's because, you know, how sexy is this thing? Oh, it looks gross. We don't want it. But when I was researching APIs at one point, I was amazed at how many YouTube videos there are for how to make your micro SaaS, which is how do you build your API business that just does one thing and you charge a retainer for it, like $10 a month, $20 a month. And there must be a gazillion services like that.
Yeah.
Like it's just, I mean, you know, and even today, like you go take ChatGPT and you can say, I want to write code that does X, Y, and Z to deliver the service. So you don't even have to be a really good developer. To go build your API as a service. To the point of what you're making about your risk on that, if you're not securing it properly, you can also become part of the problem. You can become the accomplice. So I'd love to know if you had a number for how big the API market is.
I've got a few stats. It's kind of impossible to estimate, but I've got a few stats that are pretty interesting. Number one is that over 80% of internet requests, not total bandwidth size, but the number of requests, right, are API calls. So just like, and that's across the entire internet, right? And it's really kind of, I know the first time I heard that, I was like, whoa, that sounds off. Can that really be true? And it's been confirmed from multiple sources. And these are companies like Akamai that have massive network operations who have insight into, you know, total volume of network traffic, et cetera, et cetera. And it's, you know, confirmed from multiple sources. If you think about like a daily interaction that you might have, let's say ordering a mobile food delivery, something like that. I talked to an engineer at one of those organizations and he was like, yeah, it's definitely above 30 API calls just for that one transaction. You know, so you order pizza delivery, easily 30 API calls that power that, right? And across multiple services. And by the way, they're sending sensitive data back and forth, like your home address and your credit card credentials, et cetera. So that's one stat that I would cite there. Another is, these kind of micro SaaS, these API as a service organizations, I think the total size of what's called the API economy, companies like this that provide their service as an API, the micro SaaS is one side of it. Probably the more famous examples would be the Stripe for payment processing, Twilio for telephony and communication services, et cetera. This is now a multi-billion-dollar industry per year, right?
Yeah, I can believe that.
And then, from the security standpoint, I'll throw a couple of sad statistics out there. The number of data records that have been breached as a result of API vulnerabilities and exploits, we're well over 1.5 billion records at this point. That is accelerating year over year, unfortunately. Last year, the number one kind of breach event of the year was the Progress Software Move It file transfer software. You might have heard about how a ransomware payload was introduced to more than 2,500 organizations around the world. Well, it turns out that the attack path for that was delivering the malicious payload over an API. And so there is also an aspect of commercial off-the-shelf software that now ships with APIs by default. So, your company might be buying a piece of software, you install it thinking, hey, it's this FTP thing that we access through a browser or via URL, but there's actually an API running there as well, and you didn't know it. So you weren't monitoring it. You don't know anything about how secure or how vulnerable it is, et cetera. So those are a few things I would throw out there, both from the overall size and unfortunately from the security problem size as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because the bill of materials that you get when you buy a piece of software, I mean, obviously, a lot of software now is SaaS, some sort of cloud offering. So, you're assuming that they as a SaaS provider are doing all the right things, but there's still proprietary software that you're buying that you can install on premise, and that'll come with its own APIs and all the rest of it. If you're putting that into, a typical lift and shift of someone deploying that software in a cloud environment where the cloud environment is not necessarily secure, or this software is calling home for whatever reason, and it's going over an unsecured port. I mean, it's just it's an unknown attack vector, and that's I mean, having worked in a few banks, the amount of regulation and rigor we go through to bring something in, people moan about it, but the amount of things we've found that just by doing some basic stuff has put some embarrassing conversations on the table.
For sure.
For a seven-figure piece of software. You're like, you didn't do this?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm curious. So I asked ChatGPT while we were talking, like, what's the most common request of an API? And I mean, it's the obvious things: weather data, financial data, location services, push notifications, SMS services, OAuth, capture, two-factor authentication. Obviously, that's, I mean, when you think about it, I mean, I always kind of laugh when I do I use Microsoft Authenticator. And every time I have to log in, I'm imagining this request going from my phone all the way through to Microsoft somewhere, come all the way back to me. It's a silly amount of traffic. It should be at this stage localized authentication.
Yeah.
But
it's sometimes the generation of those 6-digit codes doesn't always have to phone back home.
Well, yeah, but so not to moan about Microsoft too much today, because I do take the modular. So yeah, the generation of the code on both sides, in theory, there's no need for it to go anywhere, because it's just it's a maths problem.
Yeah.
But they've added this thing now, you've got to put the number in. So they'll generate the code, but then they'll say, like, you got to put the number 34 in. And Google does it too. Like, you got to pick 3 numbers.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
To thing. And the irritating thing for me is that at one point you could authenticate with that factor, but like just on the watch, I could accept and approve that it was me doing it. Yeah. But because they've added this number thing, now I have to open my phone to put the number in, and it irritates me. But the point I'm trying to make is that I'm holding the phone in my hand. I've got the laptop in front of me. So it should almost be a near field communication problem or a Bluetooth problem to be solved, not a across the world to come back to me.
Yeah. There's probably good reasons why, in the sense of, if it's a near field communication, what if you're in a coffee shop and there's somebody nearby who happens to have your username and password, and all they're lacking is that kind of approval request pushed to a near device or so on. There's probably edge cases like that they're thinking about. I will agree that the whole multi-factor authentication process has actually gotten more complex as things like, what is it, the OTP fatigue phenomenon where,
Yes.
eventually
Yeah.
people just give up and share the code or whatever because they're just getting flooded with one-time password requests or messages. Until we get to a point where it's down to something that is much more authentic, like biometrics and like consistently biometrics, there's always going to be some level of friction and pain in this.
I mean, the other thing to consider, and I don't know if you knew this, but you can set your phone to triple tap on the back, for example, to turn off biometric authentication. So you have to enter the PIN. And the reason why you want to do that is that if you were ever forced to open your phone, someone could just put the phone in front of your face and it'll open because of the face recognition. But if you turn off the biometric, then you have to put the PIN in, and often you don't have to. I mean, obviously, it depends on life or death or whatever. But in the case of lawfully opening your phone without your permission, by turning off the biometric, you'd have to put the PIN in, which means you could hold that in your head. You don't have to tell them what the PIN is.
Yeah.
The reason why I'm bringing that up is that obviously your phone, because of all that's on it, is literally opening the keys to the castle. Including your bank accounts and all that kind of stuff. And in that respect, I could understand why you'd want to call home or call somewhere else to get a code to come back.
Yeah.
Because the situation. But I think there's if go back to the use case, like I'm in my house with my laptop plugged into my home Wi-Fi, etc. That's almost a rule that we could teach the devices to say, in this case, you can just use near field communication. If I'm not at home, then lock it down even tighter. We used to do this with the laptops and stuff. When the person was traveling out of the secure building, certain the USB ports would be disabled. The Wi-Fi would only work when you've got VPN, and hotel Wi-Fi wasn't good enough. So they had hotspot cards, all sorts of APN stuff was set up. It all depends on the business and how big the risk is, how much money you got too.
It's always about risk management and figuring out what's the acceptable level for you.
Yeah. So great. So, I mean, if someone wanted to use your product, it looks like you can just sign up and run a trial. I mean, so you can download the library.
Yeah. Not only can they sign up and run a trial, the libraries are available for download. And we actually, maybe you'll be one of the first outlets to hear about this. We have launched a free tier of the FireTail offering. So for these micro SaaS businesses, for smaller organizations, or for, let's say, individual teams within a larger organization that want to kind of try it out for a more extended period of time, I think we allow up to 1 million API log files. And I think it's like 5 APIs with something like 10 endpoints each that are available free of charge. So if anybody wants to check it out, they're more than welcome to do that. It's just firetail.app. And, we're SOC 2 certified, so you can feel somewhat confident that we know what we're talking about when it comes to securing your data at the back end. And we are audited every year for this and continuous compliance checks from our own side. We also dog food our own software on our platform. So for any usage of the FireTail platform, we are actually monitoring all the API calls in and out. We look for anomalies on that side. We look for malicious patterns, etc. So we've got a pretty high level of security operations that we try to hold ourselves to. I'm not going to go say we are the absolute best in the world because I have no idea, but we do take it very, very seriously and take our responsibility of being, a custodian of customer data very seriously.
Well, if you said you're the best, I would worry because that would breed complacency.
Yeah, for sure.
So rather always be the underdog, try and be better. That's a safer place to be. Lovely. I mean, I think that's probably a good place to end. To be honest, I think you've sort of sold the route of try us out. I've sent the link to our tech guys to have a look. We can have a look and maybe sign up. I mean, it kind of fits quite nicely with what we do to work with someone like yourself. So I will follow up with you on that front.
Awesome.
Great. Thanks for your time. I look forward to chatting to you in the future. And,
sounds great, Ryan.
Don't forget to tell your partner that you've chatted to a world champion fan.
I will tell him. I'll see what his reaction is. I mean, that may put a hard stop to any possible collaboration. We'll see. No, I'm just teasing. I think they're.
I doubt it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. But look, I know the All Blacks are in a little bit of a transition phase, is what I hear, and they're looking to bring in some younger players for the next cycle. So we'll see how they go.
Yeah, Australia's the next one, so we'll see.
All right,
super.
Ryan,
good to meet you, Jeremy. All the best.
Likewise, been a pleasure. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Heather Bicknell is our producer and editor. Thank you, Heather, for your hard work on this episode. Please subscribe to the series and rate us on iTunes or the Google Play Store. Follow us on Twitter at the DWW Podcast. The show notes and transcripts will be available on the website www.digitalworkspace.works. Please also visit our website www.digitalworkspace.works and subscribe to our newsletter. And lastly, if you found this episode useful, please share with your friends or colleagues.